Welcome. I'm Fred Kempe, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And it's my great pleasure to open this enormously timely Atlantic Council front page event featuring Senator Shaheen, Democrat of New Hampshire, and Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina. Together, they are the co-chairs of the Senate NATO Observers Group, with whom I recently spent time at the NATO Madrid Summit. Atlantic Council Front Page is our premier platform for global leaders. This edition is hosted by the Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative. Last week, President Vladimir Putin further escalated the dangers swirling around his war in Ukraine through his promised mobilization of 300,000 troops, his illegal plans to annex occupied Ukrainian territory, and his only thinly veiled threats of nuclear weapons use. We have witnessed remarkable U.S. leadership and transatlantic solidarity and unity since Putin's February 24th invasion, both in providing assistance to Ukraine and in bolstering NATO's deterrence and defense on the eastern flank. Bipartisan support from Congress has been crucial and consistent for supporting Ukraine and for strengthening NATO, including the remarkable 95-1 ratification by the Senate of membership applications for Finland and Sweden. Senators Shaheen and Tillis have been at the forefront of these efforts. Today, we look forward to hearing from them as the war moves into a dangerous new phase. To our audience, thank you all for joining us from all over the world for this important discussion. I encourage all of you watching to join the conversation on social media and share any questions you have using the hashtag #ACFrontPage, hashtag #ACFrontPage. And now, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to our moderator, Nick Schifrin, Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Nick, take it away.
Fred, thank you very much, and welcome, Senators, to this fantastic and very timely, as Fred just said, panel on Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and we'll also touch a little bit about China and the Black Sea region. I want to remind our audience what Fred just said. Please submit questions on Twitter, on social media via hashtag #ACFrontPage or inside Zoom. You can submit via the chat tab, and we'll try and go about 30 minutes or so and leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So Senator Jeanne, let me start with you. I just returned from Ukraine. I was in Kharkiv, where I saw some of the successes that Ukraine has had along the Eastern Front. In Kharkiv, approaching Luhansk from the north. We've seen some success as well in the south, in Kherson. And at the same time, we see this most dramatic escalation since February, as Fred just detailed, both the mobilization announced by Putin and the imminent annexation of at least 4 parts of Ukraine. So give us a sense of where you see this war today and where it's going. Oh, Senator, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Vladimir Putin is responding to the successes of the Ukrainians and their counteroffensive because he is clearly getting desperate. And he showed that with the call up of the draft in Russia and the pictures coming out of Russia over the weekend, the amazing lines at the borders as people try and escape the draft, the demonstrations that are going on in the country, and the interviews with Russians who acknowledge that they want to leave the country because they don't want to be part of this war. They don't want to go fight in a war that they don't believe in. That has been amazing. And it raises the specter of what is Putin going to do next? And as you pointed out, there are veiled threats of using nuclear weapons. And I think it's been very important for the Biden administration to be very strong in the response that there would be significant reprisals for anything that Putin may do with respect to nuclear weapons. We need to be very clear that we have red lines and what those are. So I think it's not yet clear what the next phase of this war will be, but what is continuing to be so important has been the unified response from the West to what Putin is doing.
Senator Tillis, we'll certainly talk about that unified response, and I do want to come back to the nuclear threats in detail and also what the administration has responded, but talk a little bit more about the state of the war as you see it. Again, great success that we've seen just in the last few weeks by the Ukrainians, especially in the east, a little slower in the south, but they are going to struggle to seize back most, all of the territory that they say they need to seize back before diplomacy can begin. And winter is coming. So there's a lot of people in Kyiv, as you know, who are worried about this conflict freezing a little bit when that winter starts. So Senator Tillis, tell us how you see this conflict evolving the next few weeks and months.
Well, I think the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian army have demonstrated that they're resilient, that they're good stewards of the resources that the United States, our NATO partners and allies are providing to them. They're quick studies. They've got entirely new weapon systems. They've demonstrated what I think is extraordinary skill over a short period of time. There's no doubt that during the winter that the conflict may reduce somewhat, but there's going to be troop movements. There are going to be offensives. There are going to be counteroffensives. And the United States and our NATO partners and allies need to make sure that we continue to provide the support, humanitarian assistance, lethal military aid, and training that's necessary for them to sustain it. And I think that they've demonstrated that they're a good investment, and we have to continue to communicate to the people here in the United States and across the free world that this is important, that we all have a stake in it, and that we need to stand for Ukraine's freedom.
Senator Shaheen, do you acknowledge that Ukraine will struggle to reseize some of this territory back in the next few weeks before winter starts? And what's the implication of that moving forward?
Well, they have a big challenge, but one of the amazing things has been the willingness of the Ukrainians to fight against those overwhelming odds on the part of the Russians. And as Senator Tillis said, it's been important not just to have bipartisan support for that effort in Congress, but also to have the Ukrainians be helping us in making the case to our publics here in the United States and in other Western allied countries about why that's so important. Now, this week I had a chance to meet with 4 women of the Ukrainian military. They were so impressive. And one of the women said to me, they were making the case for why the United States needs to continue to provide the arms that it's going to take for them to win the war. And one young woman said to me, we want you to give us the arms so that we can fight the Russians so that you don't have to. And I think continuing to help us with making the case, not just in Congress, but to the voters in my state of New Hampshire and across this country about why this is such an important effort for us to support is really critical. And President Zelensky has been masterful at continuing to make the world aware of the challenges that they're facing and the successes they have and what they need. And that is very important as we go into the winter. And as you point out, holding on to the gains that they've made is going to be challenging. The economic situation in the country of Ukraine is very difficult, and making sure that we can continue to provide the arms that they need. All of that is going to be critical in order for them to hold on to those gains and to continue to make this offensive as strong as possible before the winter months set in, when we know it's going to get much tougher.
And Senator Tillis, one last question about the battlefield. Obviously, many of the Russian tactics have been ridiculed since February, March, we've seen a real deficiency tactically, operationally, as well as in many of their vehicles, as well as munitions. And yet, there are 150,000 Russian troops dedicated to Ukraine right now. They promise an additional 300,000. Again, we see all the videos of people showing up, questioning the mobilization, but still, is there a concern that as that number, 300,000, even if they can't reach that, if the number of Russian troops in and around Ukraine is even doubled, that Ukraine will struggle or could struggle even more as Russia sends more troops to the front?
Well, there's no question that, one of the biggest surprises, I think, since February the 24th is how inept the Russian military is at executing what we thought that they would be able to do in multiple domains. I mean, we have to keep in mind, it's been publicly reported that Russia thought that they were going to establish air superiority within a couple of days and control on the ground, including Kyiv, within a couple of weeks, and it's completely failed. We now know that their non-commissioned officer corps is a shambles. It could take them a decade or more to actually have those officers who are commanding on the ground to have the confidence in the enlisted people who are fighting the fight. I think that Russia has a serious credibility problem. I think Putin has a serious credibility problem with the very people that he's asking to lay down more lives. They've already lost in either fatalities or casualties estimates of somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people. I believe that he's going to have a difficult time. We're talking about the challenges that Ukraine will have over the winter. They will be there, but their fighting spirit is not one of their challenges. Quite the contrary in Russia. And Putin can only go so long until he has to admit that he has suffered more casualties in the months since this war started than he did in the entire engagement in Afghanistan. He has to go on to admit that he's only a couple of years away from grounding half of his commercial fleet so he can cannibalize parts to try and sustain a war. I think that the internal pressure in the Kremlin and the internal pressure that he's ultimately going to get from his own population is a far greater threat over the winter than the Ukrainians will have.
Let's talk about how Putin is responding to that. We've mentioned it a couple of times with a very overt, obvious nuclear threat. This weekend, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was on the morning shows, and he said this: any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia. That phrase was very specific and repeated 3 times, and we have been clear and specific about what that will entail. Senator Shaheen, you first. Do you believe the administration has been clear and specific enough with the Russians behind closed doors and now in public? And what do you think the planning and response should be for any kind of Russian nuclear event?
Well, one of the things that Jake Sullivan also acknowledged was that there are continued conversations with top Russian leadership, sort of the red phone that we remember from the old Soviet days, that those conversations are ongoing, and that's very important. I think the president at the UN was very clear in front of the world community of nations about our position and the concern about Putin's raising the nuclear threat as he has on the war in Ukraine. He was also very clear about China in terms of letting China know clearly where the United States stands. And I think Jake Sullivan delivered that message again, as you pointed out, over the weekend. And it's a message we need to continue to deliver. And in the meantime, we need to also make sure that we are prepared to respond should we need to. And that's, we just confirmed a new head of strategic command, which is the command in the military that has oversight over all of our nuclear weapons. And we need to make sure that we are doing everything that we need to in order to prepare, but also that we are pointing out what the dangers are of escalating any nuclear conversation, so that people understand what's at stake here. And again, I think the administration is trying to act on both fronts, both to point out that we are prepared to take action if we need to, but that this is not something that we ought to be thinking about because of the catastrophic circumstances that would happen should Putin use nuclear weapons.
Senator Tillis, do you think the administration's done well enough to make sure Putin and the country knows what's at stake?
I do. I think that what was reported over the weekend was appropriate. I don't necessarily think that we should jump and game out what all of those outcomes would be. There are a number of things that we continue to do or can continue to do in terms of tightening the economic sanctions against Russia and with anyone else who cooperates with them. But we also have to be prepared to stand against the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. And I believe that to this point, the tone and the approach that the administration has used is absolutely appropriate.
Let's talk about weapons. Last week, Biden administration announced another $600 million to Ukraine. That brings the total to 15.1 billion, I believe, since February. And yet, Ukraine is asking for more. Senator Shaheen, as you know well, they are asking for ATACMS, that is longer munition for the HIMARS system, the high mobility multiple launch rocket system. Why has the U.S. still not given that longer range munition? And do you think that it's still okay not to give into Ukraine's demand for that particular munition?
Listen, I think Ukraine is doing exactly what they ought to be doing. And if I were in Ukraine right now and a Ukrainian, I would be doing exactly the same thing. The message that I heard from those 4 Ukrainian soldiers who were in my office this week was very strong about why they need the weapons, the kinds of weapons that they need. And they are making the case to Congress and to the American public about the importance of supporting them in with those weapons. And I think I'm a member of the Ukrainian caucus. We're also trying to argue with the administration that we need to be doing everything possible. And I think the administration is trying to do that. We also have to balance Ukraine's needs with our own needs for defense of the United States. And I think that's part of the conversation. And Secretary Austin is meeting regularly with the defense minister in Ukraine. They have almost weekly conversations, as I understand. They are meeting with other leaders of our allies on this effort. And I think we are continuing to try to do everything possible to support the Ukrainians in this effort.
Senator Tillis, do you agree? Is the administration doing everything possible or doing enough to support the Ukrainians? And again, I mentioned specifically some of the weapon systems that the Ukrainians continue to ask for, the longer range systems that the administration continues to deny.
I suspect that we're going to see, just as we have over the past several months, we've seen a steady flow of capabilities coming from the United States and our NATO partners and allies. As we understand the challenges on the battlefield, I believe we should be open to any sort of a solution that will help Ukrainians be successful in their fight. But we also have to keep in mind that anytime we field a major weapon system, in this case like HIMARS, there are a lot of logistical, resupply, number of other questions that have to be answered before you make the investment. And again, as I said earlier, I think the Ukrainians have demonstrated a really incredible ability to learn, master, and utilize the weapon systems that we provided them. And I think that serves as a reasonable argument to say, what more can we do to provide better standoff distances? Ukrainians have been very disciplined and the focus of their attacks, although this could easily spread beyond the borders of Ukraine. Ukraine has not done that. And anything we can do to help them secure the situation, advance on the battlefield, I think needs to be on the table. Not to diminish at all what Senator Shaheen said about balancing that against our own strategic stockpiles and the stockpiles of our allies. But we've got to balance both. We have to have an industrial base that can answer the call.
Senator Shaheen, does Germany, another country that Ukraine has criticized in terms of how much it's sent, does Germany and others need to do more to help Ukraine militarily?
I think so. I think we all need to try and do more. But again, it's a balance, and it will, as we look at what appears to be a protracted conflict, it's important for us to be able to ensure that we can provide the munitions long term that are being requested. The other thing that we haven't really talked about that I think it's important to point out is the Ukrainians have been amazing. They've been courageous. They have been smart. They have done things militarily that I certainly didn't realize they were going to be able to do. And I think that was the assessment of a lot of people at the start of this war. But one of the benefits that they have had has been the training from the United States and our allies that has been ongoing since Russia's invasion of Crimea. And that has made a very big difference, I think, as we think about the preparation for the Ukrainian military for this conflict. So that training is really critical, and it points out that wars are not just won by weapon systems and munitions. They're absolutely critical, but they're also won by strategy and by having men and women in the military who are trained, who know what they're doing, who have their eye on the mission. And certainly that's what we're seeing in Ukraine.
I met a lieutenant in the trenches in 2016. He was 22 years old and had come out of basic training, wearing American combat boots, holding an American weapon, comporting himself like an American, and contrasted that to someone who he said was just 10 years older, who was still quote unquote post-Soviet in his training. So all of that has enormously shifted Ukrainian military ability, not only just on tactics, but absolutely operationally and strategically. You're absolutely right. Senator Tillis, why don't we use that to segue into Western long-term support? So at a conference, the Yalta European Strategy Conference in Kyiv, I was just at a couple of weeks ago, President Zelensky talked about winter is coming. And that the phrase was used because Kyiv is worried about Western support waning, especially as Europeans pay more for natural gas, and Kyiv fears pressure their own governments to question some of the punishments that are on Russia. What do you think Washington can do to avoid a kind of Ukraine fatigue that I know Ukraine and others are fearing, and make sure that especially support in Washington, but also in Europe, sustains through this protracted conflict, as Senator Shaheen just pointed out?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to continue to talk about it. We have to communicate to our constituents why something thousands of miles away is so important to the United States and to Western democracy. I believe that we also have to communicate to our constituents and to our colleagues and our NATO countries and partners who've supported the effort that this is a real test. If Russia succeeds here, what does that tell China and the South China Sea? If a nation can violate international boundaries and the family of nations who believe in sovereignty and democracy were to fracture, then that only hastens the day where more of these conflicts will occur. But having said that, I feel very good about the posture of NATO, and I'm very happy with the contribution that Germany, France, other NATO countries have made. I'm excited about Finland and Sweden joining the NATO alliance and adding so much to our mutual security agreements. I think we just have to go back and remind people of the death and the despair that the Ukrainian people are experiencing because of a violation of international law on the part of one man. And we have to understand that the border, it doesn't end in Ukraine. If Putin were successful in Ukraine, do we honestly think he will stop there? We know better. We already know that he has his sights set on reestablishing the Soviet empire. This is not about a once and done incursion in Ukraine. And that's why we have to have our constituents and our policymakers be invested for the long term.
Senator Jeanne,
as Thom says, it's not just about our publics and what what's happening with the war, our adversaries are watching very carefully. So China's watching, Iran is watching, North Korea is watching. There's a lot riding on the outcome of this. And so that making that case to the voters of New Hampshire is something that's very important. I know Thom's making it in North Carolina, but we need to point out what Americans have at stake in this war.
And Senator Tillis, as you talk to people in North Carolina, I wonder if anyone has questioned whether the war is worth it. And I also want you to connect that with the idea of, we've talked about long-term support for Ukraine, but is there any further punishment that the U.S. could consider on Russia, on Putin, that perhaps could change some of his calculus? The Ukrainians certainly want the state sponsorship of terrorism designation, which I know has been hotly debated here.
Well, first and foremost, there are still a number of things that we can do economically to constrain Russia's ability to have the currency to fight the war. I think we should examine all of those. They're non-lethal, highly effective tools that we can use to actually make Putin, and particularly the Russian people in the Kremlin, ask themselves whether or not they want this to go on for months or even years. I think that we have to continue to work with countries in the region who understand what I mentioned in response to the prior question. Their sovereignty and their safety is on the line. And then back in North Carolina, yes, I do get some questions about why I would worry about the invasion of a country that some people may not even be able to identify on a map. And I go back and explain to them that every time in history that we've only looked inward, when we knew that there was a global threat, we have paid a price for it. And that price came in lives and devastation economically. We have an opportunity to avoid it by stopping Putin in Ukraine.
I've got about 7 minutes left or so, 8 minutes left on my clock. So I do want everyone to remember to send in your questions. It looks like we've got a number already. So I'll just do a bit of a lightning round, or a couple lightning rounds before going to your questions. Senator Shaheen, pick up something that I mentioned in passing there. Do you believe Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism?
I do. All we have to do is to look at the scenes from Bucha and Izum, where we've uncovered torture chambers, mass graves, and I believe, sadly, that Vladimir Putin has been sponsoring terrorism, rape as a weapon of war against the women of Ukraine. I think there's a lot of support in the Senate to look at Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism.
So I'll ask both of you this question. What's your message to President Biden, to the administration that's obviously been resisting that designation? Senator Shaheen, you first.
Well, I know that there is concern and on the part of the administration because they want to keep lines of communication open with Russia, and I appreciate that. My beef is not with the Russian people. I think most of the Russian people have been misinformed. They have been had propaganda from Putin about what's really happening in Ukraine. I don't think if they had been given the choice, they would have gone into this war without Putin. So I do think it's important for us to look at ways that we can continue to keep dialogue with the Russians, but we've got to hold Putin accountable for these war crimes. We can't let him or any other leader do what he has done in Ukraine and have the world walk away from that without holding him accountable and some of the perpetrators accountable. So I know that we're engaged in helping collect documents to look at the International Criminal Court and what could be done there. But I think we've got to look at other ways to ensure that there is accountability for what's happening here.
Senator Tillis, accountability versus dialogue?
I agree with Senator Shaheen. I think we both think that that Putin and his inner circle are absolutely guilty of being state sponsors of terror. All you have to do is look at their investment in the Wagner Group, not only in Ukraine, but in Africa, where they are killing, raping, and terrorizing people across the globe. The administration does have to walk a fine line when you're talking about a nuclear power and you're trying to de-escalate the situation. But I do believe that there is a strong recognition by members of Congress in both the House and the Senate that they are a state sponsor of terror, and they should be held accountable in the same way that any other organization has been designated as such.
27 NATO parliaments have ratified Sweden and Finland. The three that are left, Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia. President Erdogan, especially of Turkey, has set conditions on Sweden that the Swedish government has certainly said might be difficult. Senator Shaheen, you first. What's the message to those three countries that haven't ratified? Is there perhaps some private messaging as well, working on those countries, trying to make sure that they do ratify soon?
I think there are ongoing negotiations to encourage Slovakia, Turkey, and Hungary to go ahead and ratify Finland and Sweden. And it's in NATO's interest. It's in the interest of those three countries because the security, what Sweden and Finland bring to NATO is significant, and it's important to get them included just as soon as we can.
Senator Tillis, should the U.S., should NATO be doing more to bolster the eastern flank even more, and obviously take on the Sweden and Finland question if you want to as well?
Well, clearly, Finland and Sweden need to be in NATO as quickly as possible. The United States ratified the treaty in nearly record time. We need to get the three remaining nations, Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia, to do the same thing. That's a very, very important. It's not only important because of the increased support that Finland and Sweden will give to us. They're in a very, very important part of the world. Having them as NATO allies with their Arctic capabilities, with their Baltic capabilities, with Sweden's defense industrial base, with Finland's extraordinary military. I hope that my colleagues in Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia recognize that this is an important matter and it needs to be done very, very quickly.
I had a defense official point to the map and say Finland's F-35 purchase alone redraws how NATO thinks about its Northeast. All right, let's move. Let's expand out a little bit. I want to talk about the Black Sea and China as well. And actually, we've got a couple of questions on the Black Sea, which I know Senator Shaheen wants to talk about. So I will kind of combine what I wanted to ask with a few of these questions. So we've got questions from Vincent Campos and Colleen Graffi about the Black Sea Security Act. So let me just mention, Senator Shaheen, you and Senator Romney are the co-sponsors on bipartisan legislation calling for U.S. strategy on the Black Sea. So why do we need more of or a new strategy on the Black Sea, and what should the U.S. be doing to thwart any kind of Russian activity in the Black Sea region?
Well, first of all, we haven't had a strategy for the Black Sea region, and that's been very apparent in this war. And all you have to do to look at how important that region is to see what's happened with the inability to get grain shipments out that are so critical to feeding so much of the world, because Russia's been able to keep that from happening. And so I think the effort by the UN to open up those shipping lanes has been important, but it's only a fraction of what we need to get done. So this is a very important region. It's important to all of the countries that border the Black Sea, but it's also important to the United States and the rest of the world. And we need a strategy that recognizes the collaboration between our agencies within the United States government, between our military and our State Department and our economic policies. But we also need to think about working with those countries that border the Black Sea about how we can work going forward to ensure that we're not in a position 10 years, 20 years from now where Russia can blockade the Black Sea in the way that they have in this war.
Colleen Graffi specifically asks, is it time to update and modernize the Montreux Convention governing naval activity in the Black Sea to prevent the Black Sea from becoming a Russian lake?
Yes, I think it is. And, I have to think about where we might be if in the lead up to the war in Ukraine, if some of the Western allies had left some of our ships in the Black Sea, whether that might have put us in a better position come the start of the war in Ukraine. So I do think we've got to take a look at that. And again, we need a strategy for this region going forward, and that's a piece of it.
Senator Tillis, let's look at China. So NATO has now officially been willing to talk about China in its documents, of course, and so much of the U.S. focus still today, certainly before, but for the future, no doubt, will be on Beijing. Let's start with this question. What do you believe Beijing's lessons are? What are they taking from the war in Ukraine, obviously, when it comes to Taiwan?
Well, if you put that in context, there were a lot of good things that came out of the NATO summit in Madrid, but I think a broader recognition that China is a pacing threat and a threat that should be relevant to all NATO allies is important. So now China takes a look at when everybody thought NATO was fractured, the extraordinary coordinated response we have had since February the 24th. They need to understand that not only does that recognize a significant military alliance, but it also recognizes a huge economy, combining the economies of NATO and the United States. And China has to understand that if we were quick to do what we had to do to have a consequence for Russia, if they were to do something similar, they should expect a similar response. And hopefully that by itself has a calming influence over China's aspirations. The most obvious one is Taiwan. But as you know, they're investing across the globe. And in many cases, you question whether or not that's purely for economic purposes. So I think they're watching. They're seeing an alliance that was stress tested and stood up to the stress test. And they're watching our resolve over time, which is why it's critically important that we maintain the commitment to Ukraine for the duration until there's a successful outcome as defined by the Ukrainian people.
Do you fear also, though, that one of the lessons could be, as we've talked about, the Ukrainians have really been trained and assisted by the Americans much more today, but still, nonetheless, for 8 years. The Taiwanese are going through a slow modernization effort in which its government has a little bit of fighting amongst itself of how to fight in a kind of what we call a porcupine way, a hybrid way that we saw the Ukrainians fight so successfully around Kyiv at the beginning. Could Beijing take the opposite lesson, which is that they need to speed up, that before the Taiwanese really embrace a hybrid strategy, before the Americans can really help them for many years, Beijing needs to launch earlier rather than later?
I don't think so. I think if you take a look at how China has been able to be successful, it's been largely through some of their investments in capitalism and reaping the rewards from it. You have to keep in mind, China now has a middle class that's twice the size of the population of the United States. If they're looking at something that could cause a severe economic disruption to an economy that's already on thin ice, that has to, in my opinion, has to be a mitigating factor for thinking they can move quickly and test our resolve.
And Senator Shaheen, let me just give you a chance on China as well. We've got a question from Anka as part of the Atlantic Council here. What should NATO's role be in addressing the China's challenge? And can the European allies play a larger role when it comes to China? They have come along, I would say, in the last couple of years, but certainly nowhere near as far as, frankly, both the Trump and the Biden administration has wanted them to be.
Well, that's right. But that's why the new strategic concept at NATO is so important. And the mentioning of China, the fact that when we were at the summit in Madrid, there were 4 Pacific countries that were there: South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. The recognition that what happens in the Indo-Pacific region in the Far East is very important to Europe, to NATO, and to the United States. And I think that will become increasingly recognizable as we go into the future. One of the pieces of legislation that's just passed in the Foreign Relations Committee has been a bill to address Taiwan and to provide assistance to Taiwan and to to think about ways in which we can continue to support them, because they are a democracy, and going forward, so that hopefully we don't get to a position where China decides that they are going to invade Taiwan in the same way that Russia invaded Ukraine.
And certainly there's been a debate about that bill, especially calling Taiwan a major non-NATO ally and changing the name of TECRO, the Taiwanese Economic and Cultural Representative Office, to Taiwan.
Yeah, I would point out, Nick, though, that some of those concerns have been addressed in the bill as it came out of committee.
No, absolutely. We've got 5 minutes left, and we've got one question that I want to spend the rest of the time debating. It's a big one, but I think we can do it in 5 minutes, I predict. So Harlan Ullman asked this, and Senator Tillis, let me start with you, and I'll just ask it directly as he put it. When thinking about the end of the war, should U.S. strategy begin to include off-ramps? When should diplomacy begin in earnest?
Only when President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people believe that it's something they can accept. I, for one, cannot imagine a scenario where we should tell a nation who has lost tens of thousands of people, whose women have been raped and murdered, that now is the time to negotiate something that falls short of what they, the Ukrainian people, think is the best outcome in the best interest of the Ukrainian people.
Senator Shaheen, does that include if we have to support Kyiv militarily and economically? They need $5 billion a month, as I think you were pointing out earlier, if we have to do that indefinitely?
Well, again, I think the position of the administration, and it's been supported in a bipartisan way, and certainly in the Senate and in Congress, the House as well, has been that the Ukrainians need to make that decision, as Senator Tillis said, about when they're willing to negotiate. And I had a chance to read your interview with Foreign Minister Kuleba, where he pointed out that agreeing to start negotiating with Russia at the point at which Russia is at its lowest, and it may not be the best time to try and negotiate, because Vladimir Putin may have something else up his sleeve. So again, that's why I think we've got to let the Ukrainians decide what makes the most sense for them, and to support them in every way that we can.
And Nick, just to add to that very quickly, the reason why I think it's so important to come out of Ukraine is that, are we going to have a discussion about Moldova? Are we going to have a discussion about other nations that are within the crosshairs of Putin's desire to reestablish the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire? To me, that's why it's so important to make sure that the people who are suffering the most have sole say in what a reasonable outcome is.
And so does that mean, and we can end with this question, we've got a couple minutes left. Does that mean to both of you, as Harlan was asking about the off-ramps, the off-ramps will only exist if Zelensky builds them? Is that pretty much where you guys stand right now?
That's where I am.
It is. And again, I think one of the ways to help President Zelensky and Ukraine build those off-ramps is to provide the support they need now so they can be successful on the battlefield, so that Russia doesn't have other options. They know they're losing, and it's in their interest to be willing to negotiate with the Ukrainians.
And of course, the concern now is the war is about to escalate. If Russia is about to annex, territory that they only partially control of Ukraine, certainly Putin will claim that those areas are protected by Russian strategic weapons. Although I would argue that Ukraine has called that bluff a little bit in attacking Crimea. Senator Tillis, you got the last word. I know I've pushed you a couple of times now on kind of being worried about the winter, and given what we just said about the war escalating. But the bottom line is, it sounds like you're pretty positive about the direction of NATO, the direction of the Western Alliance, and Ukraine's ability to fight back on Russia.
I'm very proud of what I've seen in the United States response and the response of NATO. I think it's critically important. This is a This is just not a war that's between two countries that may settle itself with negotiations at some point in time. This is a great power trying to reestablish a failed empire and to go through every country that he can to murder and occupy to that end. This is a historic moment, and we have to stand up and hopefully leave a good page in history for the way that we responded and supported the Ukrainian people.
Well, part of my moderating duties is the responsibility of ending on time, and we are right there. So on behalf of Senator Tillis, Senator Shaheen, thank you all for participating with us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for submitting your questions, and thanks for being part of the Atlantic Council front page event. And senators, thank you. Always a pleasure to talk to you both.